Mark Miller pulled into the sweeping cobblestone driveway of his estate in Greenwich, Connecticut, at exactly 6:15 in the evening on a Tuesday. This was 45 minutes later than he had promised himself. He would be home, a recurring failure that sat heavy in his chest like a lead weight. Before the engine of his luxury sedan even stopped humming, he reached up to loosen his silk tie, the constriction of the fabric feeling more like a noose than a fashion choice. He pressed his forehead against the cool leather of the steering wheel for 3 long seconds, inhaling the scent of expensive interior and stale ambition before stepping out into the humid evening air. He carried nothing but his smartphone and the silent, gnawing guilt of a man who continued to make promises to a 4-year-old girl that he simply could not find the way to keep. The house was an architectural marvel, a sprawling 6-bedroom colonial with a backyard pool that looked like a blue mirror and a kitchen designed to host 12 people for a formal dinner. However, for the last year and a half, the magnificent structure had felt less like a home and more like a mausoleum, a place where everything was polished to a perfect shine, but nothing felt truly alive. His daughter Lily was only 4 years old, possessing wavy brown hair that fell just below her small shoulders and large honey-colored eyes that observed the world with a haunting intensity. She carried a weight in those eyes that no child of her age should ever have to bear, and she possessed a voice that no one had heard for 14 months. Not since the cold February morning when her mother went to the hospital for a routine procedure and never returned. Mark opened the heavy oak front door in total silence, the hinges perfectly oiled so as not to make a sound. The house was unnervingly quiet, save for the muffled rhythmic clinking of ceramic plates being tucked away into a kitchen cabinet somewhere in the distance. That would be Hannah Smith, the new housekeeper he had hired 3 months ago after the previous one had quit without a single day of notice. Hannah was a quiet woman, efficient and unassuming, who always finished her tasks without needing to be told twice. That was the extent of what Mark knew about her, and in his grief-clouded mind, he believed that was all he needed to know. He placed his phone on the marble console table in the hallway and began the slow, familiar walk toward Lily's bedroom. It was the same walk he made every night, a ritual of hope and inevitable disappointment, praying that this evening would be the one where the silence finally broke. The door to Lily's room was cracked open, just a tiny sliver, a thin line of warm light spilling out onto the dark hallway carpet. Mark pushed it open with agonizing care, his heart hammering against his ribs as he peered inside the sanctuary of her world. Lily was sitting on the floor beside her bed, her knees pulled tightly against her chest as she gripped a single crayon in her right hand. She was focused on a large sheet of white paper, her small body hunched over as if she were protecting the secrets she was laying down in wax and color. Scattered across the carpet around her were dozens of other drawings spread out like fallen leaves in an autumn forest. Some were vibrant and chaotic, while others were dark and minimalist, but all of them were executed with a level of detail that didn't match the typical scribbles of a preschooler. Mark stepped into the room softly, trying not to disturb the fragile atmosphere. "Hi, sweetheart. I'm home," he whispered, his voice cracking slightly under the weight of his own exhaustion. Lily did not look up. She didn't even flinch. She continued to draw slow, deliberate strokes, with a red crayon pressing so hard against the paper that the wax threatened to snap under the pressure. She acknowledged his presence, the only way she knew how, a slight shift of her weight, a subtle tilt of her head in his direction. But there were no words, and there was no eye contact. There was only the rhythmic scratching of the crayon, a sound that had become the primary language of their hollowed-out home. Mark crouched down beside her, his expensive suit trousers straining against his knees as he looked at the drawing. It was a large house with 2 stick figures inside. One was tall and stood near a door, while the other was very small and sat alone in a room filled with red shapes. They could have been flowers, or they could have been something much more ominous, like droplets of blood or tears. He desperately wanted to ask her what it meant to sit there and decode every single line his daughter had labored over, but he had tried that many times before. Whenever he pushed for an explanation, Lily would simply stop drawing, drop the crayon, and wait in a frozen, statuesque silence until he left the room. It was as if his very attention made it impossible for her to continue expressing whatever was trapped inside her. So he did what he always did. He leaned over and kissed the top of her head, inhaling the scent of baby shampoo and sorrow. "I love you," he whispered, before retreating, pulling the door back to the exact sliver of an opening he had found. In the dim light of the hallway, he stood still for a moment, the way a man stands when he is holding a burden so heavy that he is afraid any movement will cause his spine to snap. 14 months. That was how long Lily had been living in a world of absolute silence. The high-priced specialists in Manhattan called it selective mutism, a condition triggered by the profound trauma of losing her mother, Claire. Claire had been 31 years old when she went in for a surgery that the doctors described as low risk and common. She never woke up from the anesthesia. Mark had been the one to tell Lily that night, holding her in their bed, and from that moment on, Lily simply stopped speaking. "Sindri!" The silence had not come on gradually. It was as if a light switch had been flipped in a dark room. Lily didn't fade away. She simply closed the doors to her vocal cords and retreated into a fortress of her own making, leaving Mark on the outside looking in. He had spared no expense hiring the most renowned child psychologists in the New England area, including Dr. Beatrice Miller, who came to the house twice a week for 6 months. Dr. Miller brought puppets, picture cards, sensory toys, and structured play routines designed to coax a voice out of a child who had decided the world wasn't worth talking to. Lily would participate, she would point, and she would play, but she would never utter a single sound. Dr. Miller eventually told Mark that Lily wasn't refusing to speak, but rather she was currently incapable of it. The trauma had built a skyscraper of a wall between her emotions and her expression, and that wall would not come down on a doctor's schedule. It would only fall when Lily found a person or a place that made her inner world feel safe enough to bridge the gap to the outer world. Mark understood the theory perfectly, but understanding didn't make the quiet of the dinner table any easier to swallow. He tried changing her school to a small, nurturing private academy, with teachers trained in childhood grief. But the result was the same. Lily was the perfect silent student. He had even tried music therapy, art therapy, and a weekend retreat in the Berkshire Mountains specifically designed for bereaved children. He had flown in a specialist from California who had published groundbreaking research on trauma-induced mutism in children under the age of 5. Every new approach added a layer of academic understanding, but none of them added a voice to his daughter's throat. And then there was Victoria. Victoria Moore had entered Mark's life 10 months after Claire passed away, bringing with her an air of corporate efficiency and polished elegance that Mark mistook for stability. She was a communications consultant who knew exactly how to manage public perception with the precision of a surgeon. They had met at a charity gala in Westport, and she had been incredibly supportive when he spoke about Lily's condition. She was sympathetic when he described the crushing silence of his home, and reassuring when he admitted his utter helplessness. Within 4 months, she had moved into the Greenwich estate, and within 6, Mark had asked her to marry him. She wore the diamond ring with the natural ease of someone who had always expected it. The house adjusted around her presence like water around a stone. It didn't resist her, but it didn't truly absorb her either. Victoria was excellent with appearances, knowing exactly when to hold Lily's hand in public. She knew how to smile at the right moments during school events, and how to tell Mark's extended family that she was deeply committed to being a mother figure for the broken little girl. People believed her because she was convincing in the way only someone who has practiced sincerity can be. However, inside the walls of the house when the cameras were off and the guests were gone, Victoria's patience with Lily was thinner than a sheet of parchment paper. She was never overtly cruel, and she never raised her voice in a way that would alarm a neighbor. But she had a way of sighing and rolling her eyes that only a child could truly feel. Hannah Smith began her tenure at the house on a rainy Monday morning, arriving at 7:30, with a small canvas bag and a folded apron. She possessed a stillness that didn't feel like shyness. It felt like a deliberate choice, like someone who had learned that listening was far more valuable than talking. Mark met her briefly in the kitchen, handing her a list of responsibilities that included deep cleaning laundry and basic meal preparation. He told her flatly that his daughter lived in the house but would not interact with her. "She doesn't talk," he had said, his voice dry and factual, the way a man speaks when he has given the same explanation 100 times. Hannah had simply nodded her expression, neutral and kind. She didn't tilt her head with pity or ask intrusive questions about the mother. She simply said, "I understand," and began to work. For the first 2 weeks, Hannah and Lily existed in the same house, like two silent planets, orbiting a distant sun, aware of each other, but never colliding. Hannah cleaned around the little girl without disturbing her focus, prepared her snacks, and placed her plate on the table without any forced chatter. When Lily left her drawings scattered across the hardwood floors, Hannah would pick them up with a gentle touch, stacking them neatly on the desk in her room. It was this tiny, almost invisible detail that created the first microscopic crack in Lily's armor. One afternoon, Lily walked into her room after school and found her drawings organized in a perfect, respectful pile on her desk, instead of being shoved into a drawer or left in a chaotic heap. She stood there for a long minute, just staring at the stack of paper. Then she walked slowly into the kitchen, where Hannah was scrubbing the sink. She stood in the doorway and watched the woman not with suspicion, but with the careful attention of a child who had noticed something significant and was deciding what it meant for her safety. Hannah looked up, gave a small nod of acknowledgement, not a theatrical smile or a baby talk greeting, and went back to her work. Lily stayed there for exactly 11 seconds before turning and retreating to her room. The next day, Lily came downstairs while Hannah was mopping the marble floor in the living room. Hannah had a habit of humming while she worked low, constant melodies that weren't for anyone's benefit, but her own. Lily sat on the bottom step of the grand staircase and watched the mop move back and forth, her eyes following the hum as if it were a physical shape she was trying to trace in the air. "Teet-teet!" Hannah noticed the child sitting there, but didn't stop humming or turn it into a moment. She simply allowed the girl to exist in her space for as long as she wanted. That was the first afternoon that Lily stayed in the same room as Hannah for more than 5 minutes by her own choice. Hannah understood exactly what was happening because she had lived through it once before, with her nephew David. David was the son of her older sister, and he had lived with Hannah's family in a small rural town in Maine after his father died in a tragic construction accident. David had been 7 years old at the time. After the funeral, David had stopped talking completely. He went from being a boisterous, laughing boy who narrated every second of his life to a child who communicated only with nods and the occasional drawing left on the kitchen table. Hannah's sister had tried everything the family could afford, which wasn't much. They saw a local counselor and a church grief group, And they even tried the grandmother's herbal teas, believing the silence was a spiritual retreat. But what actually brought David back was an accident of shared space. Hannah had been sitting on the back porch one evening sketching in a notebook to relax after a long day of work. David had wandered out, sat beside her without being invited, and watched her pen move across the paper. After 10 minutes, he reached into her bag, took out a pencil, and started drawing on the very edge of her page. Hannah hadn't reacted. She just kept drawing her own picture. For weeks they sat on that porch side by side, sharing a single page without a word being spoken between them. Slowly, David began to add labels to his drawings, first names, then short descriptions. Until one night he looked at Hannah and said, "Can you draw a horse? Mine always look like dogs." It was the first full sentence he had spoken in months. Hannah had to bite the inside of her cheek to keep from sobbing, because she knew that a big emotional reaction would make him retreat. She just said, "Horses are hard. Let me show you the trick for the legs." The door had opened not because she had kicked it down, but because she had sat by it long enough for him to feel safe enough to turn the handle. So when Hannah saw Lily sitting on the stairs in the Greenwich house, she recognized that specific expression. It was the look of someone who wanted to come closer, but needed to know that the person on the other side wouldn't demand anything in return. She made a quiet decision not to tell Mark or Victoria about these small interactions. She didn't want this to become a project or a milestone to be measured by a stopwatch. She knew that if Mark knew, he would start hovering, and if Victoria knew, she would turn it into a performance. Hannah knew something that none of the Manhattan specialists had told Mark, that sometimes the cure for a profound silence isn't a better question, but a safer presence. She decided she would simply be there and wait. She would be the one constant quiet thing in a house that was otherwise filled with the loud, frantic energy of people trying to fix a broken child. The real shift happened during the 3rd week of her employment. Hannah was sitting at the kitchen island during her scheduled break, sketching a small bird on the back of a grocery receipt. Lily appeared in the doorway, clutching a red crayon and a piece of paper, her eyes locked on Hannah's moving hand. Hannah looked up, then looked back down at her sketch, leaving the space open without filling it with expectations. Lily walked to the table, pulled out the heavy chair, with a loud scrape climbed up and placed her paper on the granite surface. They sat there for 40 minutes in a silence that felt heavy, but not hollow. There were no words and no eye contact, only the sound of wax on paper and the low hum of the designer refrigerator. When Lily was finished, she slid her drawing across the table toward Hannah. It was a deliberate, careful gesture. Hannah studied the drawing. It was a house with 3 figures, one tall, one small, and one in the middle that wasn't as big as the first, but wasn't as tiny as the second. Hannah looked at it for a long time, then slid her own drawing of the bird over to Lily. It was a trade, not a lesson. A conversation had taken place without a single vibration of a vocal cord. Lily looked at the bird, then looked at Hannah, and for the first time, her honey-colored eyes seemed to soften. It was like a door that had been locked for years, suddenly clicked the bolt, moving just a fraction of an inch. From that day forward, drawing together became their daily ritual. Every afternoon at the same time they sat at the kitchen island and worked. Hannah never formalized it, never prepared special materials, and never announced that it was time to draw. She simply sat down, and Lily followed. The drawings began to evolve from static houses to scenes with movement sunlight in the corners and flowers in windows. The 3rd figure, the one in the middle, started appearing in every single one of Lily's drawings, always standing close to the smallest figure. Hannah kept every one of these papers in a folder tucked under the kitchen sink, hidden not out of a desire for secrecy, but out of an instinct for protection. She knew that the relationship was still made of glass, and she wasn't ready to let the world's heavy hands touch it yet. She was waiting for the moment when the glass turned into something stronger like steel or oak. And then, on a Thursday afternoon 5 weeks later, the silence finally shattered. Too dirtful. They were sitting side by side as they always did, and Hannah had just finished a quick sketch of a cat in the corner of the page. Lily leaned in her hair, brushing against Hannah's arm, and she whispered a single word. It was so low that Hannah almost missed it. It was more of a breath than a sound, a tiny vibration that barely left the little girl's lips. "Kitty," she said. One word. 5 letters. 14 months of silence broken not by a therapist or a doctor, but by a drawing of a cat and a woman who never asked her to speak. Hannah's hand stopped moving, but she kept her eyes on the paper, refusing to gasp. She knew from her experience with David that a big reaction would be fatal to this progress. If she turned and hugged Lily or started crying, the girl would likely bolt back into her fortress and lock the door twice as hard. So Hannah kept her voice as calm as if they had been chatting every day for years. "Do you like cats?" she asked softly. There was a long, agonizing pause, where the only sound was the ticking of the grandfather clock in the foyer. Then Lily gave a small, firm nod. Hannah drew another cat, a smaller one, right next to the first. "This one is the baby," Hannah said. Another pause followed, even longer this time. Then Lily spoke again, her voice just a fraction louder. "Baby kitty." 2 words. Hannah felt a lump the size of a golf ball forming in her throat, and her eyes burned with unshed tears, but she kept her face as serene as a lake. She drew a 3rd cat, the largest of the group. "And this one is the mommy." Lily stared at the 3 cats for a long time, her small hand gripping the red crayon so hard her knuckles turned white. She didn't speak again for the rest of that session, but she didn't leave the table either. She stayed for another 20 minutes, drawing her own row of cats at the bottom of the page. Before she got up to leave, she did something she hadn't done with anyone since her mother died. She placed her small flat palm on Hannah's forearm for exactly 2 seconds. It was a gesture of profound trust, a physical bridge across the gap of her grief. Then she pulled her hand back and walked quietly to her room. Hannah sat at that kitchen island for a long time after the girl left, staring at the drawings of the cats until the sun began to set behind the Connecticut hills. She didn't tell Mark that evening, nor the next. She wanted to be sure that the door was truly open and not just cracked by a passing breeze. A single word could be an accident, but a conversation was a choice. Over the next 2 weeks, the whispers grew steadily. Lily began to name the things they drew: bird, house, blue. It was always to Hannah, and it was always while they were drawing. She never spoke in front of Victoria, and she still hadn't spoken to her father. One afternoon, while they were sitting on the floor, because they had run out of room on the table, Lily looked at Hannah and whispered, "Can you stay after dinner?" Hannah, her heart nearly bursting, replied, "Of course I can, sweetheart." It was a Thursday night at 11:40 in the evening when Mark was sitting in his home office, unable to sleep. He was reviewing quarterly reports, but his mind kept wandering to the strange, quiet shifts he had noticed in the house. He decided on a whim to check the security camera footage from the previous 24 hours. He had installed the cameras 2 years ago as a security measure, but after Claire died, they became a way for him to obsessively monitor a world that had proven it could take everything away in an instant. He scrolled through the footage casually: the kitchen at noon, the hallway at 3, the living room at 6. Everything looked normal. Then he reached the recording from 2 o'clock in the morning the night before. The kitchen was dark, the only illumination coming from a single pendant light over the island. At 2:07 in the morning, a small figure appeared in the doorway. It was Lily, her pajamas rumpled, looking exactly like a child who had just woken up from a terrifying nightmare. Her arms were wrapped around her middle and her eyes were wide with a frantic, searching energy. She didn't head for the stairs to find her father. She walked toward the back of the house, toward the small room where Hannah slept. She stood outside the door for 12 seconds, not knocking, just waiting in the shadows. Then the door opened, and Hannah appeared wearing a simple t-shirt and loose pants. She looked down at Lily, without a shred of surprise, as if this were a common occurrence. She didn't ask what was wrong or make a fuss. She simply stepped aside to let the girl in, then followed her back to the kitchen. Mark watched breathless as the scene unfolded on his computer screen. Hannah turned on the low light over the island, pulled 2 fresh sheets of paper from a drawer, and sat down on the hardwood floor right there in the middle of the kitchen. Lily sat down beside her, their shoulders almost touching, and they began to draw. Mark watched the silent footage for 38 minutes. At 2 o'clock in the morning, while he was upstairs tossing and turning in a bed that felt too large, his daughter was finding peace on the kitchen floor with a woman he barely knew. There were no grand gestures, just 2 people sharing a quiet space, because one of them needed it, and the other understood. At 2:45, Lily's head began to droop with exhaustion. She leaned her weight against Hannah's shoulder, a slow, trusting movement like a sapling leaning into the wind. Within 2 minutes, the girl was fast asleep. Hannah didn't move an inch. She stayed exactly where she was, one arm wrapped protectively around the child, and the other braced against the floor. She remained there wide awake and holding a child that wasn't hers until 3:20 in the morning. Only then did she carefully lift Lily and carry her back upstairs to her bed, tucking her in with a tenderness that Mark hadn't seen since Claire was alive. Mark had to pull his car over to the side of the road the next morning because he had been rewatching the footage on his phone while driving to the office. The tears were streaming down his face so heavily that he couldn't see the lines on the pavement. He sat there under a street lamp for 10 minutes, his chest heaving with the realization of how much he had missed while he was busy trying to fix things. He called Hannah's cell phone, his voice thick with emotion. "Hannah?" he said when she answered. "When was the first time she came to your door at night?" There was a brief silence on the other end of the line. "About 3 weeks ago, Mr. Miller," Hannah replied softly. Mark closed his eyes, leaning his head back against the seat. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked, not with anger, but with a profound sense of wonder. "Because she asked me not to," Hannah said. "Not with words at first, but I understood. She needed to know that someone could keep her secrets until she was ready to share them herself." Mark arrived home early that Friday, canceling every meeting after 3 o'clock, something he hadn't done in a decade. When he walked into the kitchen, the scene was so ordinary that it was almost heartbreaking. Hannah was at the counter, and Lily was at the table drawing with her usual intensity. There was no drama, just a calm, functional peace. Mark stood in the doorway, and Hannah was the first to notice him. She gave him a small nod, a look that conveyed she knew exactly what he had seen on the cameras. Mark walked to the table and pulled out a chair with exaggerated care, moving as if he were approaching a wild animal that might bolt at the slightest sound. He sat down and reached for a blue crayon. He looked at the blank paper in front of him and realized he hadn't drawn anything since he was a child himself. He felt clumsy and foolish, but he forced himself to move the crayon. He drew a circle, a terrible, lopsided, irregular circle that looked more like a squashed tomato than a geometric shape. Lily stared at it for a long moment, her honey-colored eyes darting from the paper to her father's face. Then she looked over at Hannah. Hannah didn't say a word, but the corner of her mouth twitched into the smallest of smiles. Lily looked back at the circle, and the smallest sound escaped her. It was a laugh. It was a tiny, airy sound, more of a giggle than a guffaw, but it was the most beautiful thing Mark had ever heard. It hit him in a place so deep that he had to press his hands flat against the table to keep from shaking. He drew another circle even worse than the first one on purpose this time. Lily's shoulders shook with another giggle, and she covered her mouth with her hand, her eyes sparkling with a light that had been extinguished for over a year. Hannah stepped back to the counter, turning her back to them to give them the privacy of the moment, though her own eyes were wet. Mark drew a stick figure underneath the circles and said, "That was supposed to be a dog." Lily looked at it, then grabbed her own crayon. In 3 quick, confident strokes, she drew a much better dog right next to his and slid the paper back to him. She didn't say anything, but her expression clearly said, "Now that is a dog." Mark laughed, a real hearty laugh that felt like it was clearing the dust out of his lungs. And for the first time in 14 months, his daughter laughed with him. The weeks that followed transformed the Greenwich estate in ways that no interior designer could have achieved. Mark began to restructure his entire life, not with grand announcements, but with quiet, daily choices. He started leaving the office at 4 o'clock every day, and he spent every evening at the kitchen table drawing badly and laughing often. Lily's whispers grew into full sentences in his presence, and the fortress she had built around herself began to crumble brick by brick. "That cloud looks like a whale," she told him one Saturday afternoon while they were sitting in the backyard. "Hannah draws horses better than you, Dad. Can we buy more blue crayons? I used all of mine." Each sentence landed in Mark's heart like a gift he had long ago stopped expecting to receive. He eventually sat down with Victoria on a Sunday morning, facing her across the breakfast table. "Victoria, I need to talk to you about something I saw on the security footage," he said, his voice firm and clear. Victoria's face went very still, her corporate mask sliding into place. Mark described the nighttime drawings and the breakthrough Hannah had facilitated. Then he mentioned something else. "I also went back and looked at the footage from 2 weeks before that. The night you told Lily to stop leaving her trash on the floor. The night you took her drawings, the first things she had created since her mother died, and threw them in the garbage because they didn't fit your aesthetic for a clean house." Victoria didn't flinch. "I was just tidying up Mark. I didn't know they were important." Mark looked at her for a long time, seeing her with a clarity that had been missing for months. "Everything she does is important," he said quietly. "And the fact that you didn't know that after living here for nearly a year tells me everything I need to know. I think it's best if you move out." There was no screaming match and no dramatic exit, just the quiet, certain end of a relationship that had been built on a foundation of convenience rather than care. 2 months later, Lily was enrolled in an art program at a local school, and she brought home a painting on her first day. It was a large, colorful house, with 3 figures standing in front, one tall one small, and one in the middle. For the first time, the small figure was wearing a wide, unmistakable smile. Mark had the painting framed and hung it in the living room right next to the very first drawing Lily had ever shared with Hannah. As we look at the journey of this family, there is a profound lesson to be found in the quiet corners of our lives, a wisdom that often only reveals itself once we have weathered enough storms to appreciate the stillness. In a world that is obsessed with noise, with fixing things through complex systems, high-priced experts, and loud interventions, we often forget the miraculous power of simple, unadorned presence. We live in an era that values the spectacular, the immediate, and the measurable, yet the most significant healings. The ones that truly mend the human soul almost always happen in the silence away from the spotlight and at a pace that cannot be rushed by a stopwatch or a professional's degree. The story of Mark and Lily is a reminder that trauma is not a broken machine that needs a mechanic. It is a wounded heart that needs a witness. We often think that to help someone who is suffering, we must have the right words, the perfect advice, or a revolutionary strategy. But, as Hannah showed us, the most powerful thing you can offer another human being is not your expertise, but your willingness to sit in the dark with them until they are ready to find the light. Silence is not always an absence of sound. Sometimes it is a fortress where a person is hiding until they feel safe enough to come out. If we try to kick the door down with our well-intentioned help, we only make them bolt the lock tighter. Healing requires a specific kind of patience that is rare in our modern world. A patience that doesn't ask, "When will you be better?" but instead says, "I will stay here as long as you need." This is a truth that many of us only come to understand in the later chapters of our lives. We learn that the people who changed us the most were rarely the ones who gave us the loudest advice. They were the ones who sat with us on the kitchen floor at 2 o'clock in the morning, the ones who didn't judge our messy drawings or our long silences, and the ones who respected our grief enough to let it speak in its own time. They were the invisible people, the quiet ones who did the heavy lifting of love without ever asking for a round of applause. Furthermore, we must recognize that we often overlook the housekeepers in our own lives, not just those who clean our floors, but those who quietly maintain the emotional fabric of our worlds. We tend to gravitate toward the Victorias of the world, those who are polished, impressive, and know how to say the right things in public. But true character and true healing are found in the Hannahs, those who do the right thing when no one is watching, who keep secrets to protect a child's dignity, and who understand that love is a verb that is often whispered rather than shouted. As we grow older, we realize that the museum houses we build to impress others are hollow and cold, and that a home is only truly alive when it is a place where it is safe to be broken. Ultimately, the lesson is one of humility for the adults and hope for the hurting. It tells us that no matter how long the silence has lasted, and no matter how many experts have failed to break it, there is always a path back to the light. That path is paved with small, consistent acts of kindness, a stack of drawings neatly organized, a shared crayon, a quiet hum while mopping a floor. It teaches us that the greatest gift we can give our children or anyone we love is not a life free of pain, but the certainty that they will never have to walk through that pain alone. In the end, it wasn't the billionaire's money that saved his daughter. It was a housekeeper's quiet heart and the simple, sacred act of being present.